I spent 30 years carrying a badge, believing that the truth was the only thing that mattered. But in 1994, during the hunt for a killer in the shadow of Mount Rainier, I found a witness that forced me to make an impossible choice. I solved the murder of Sarah Chen. I had the suspect, the timeline, and the testimony, but I locked the evidence away in a safe forever. Because the witness who solved the case was a creature that wasn't supposed to exist, and saving his life meant letting a human monster walk free. Before we open the case file, let me know in the comments where you are watching from today, and if you are interested in other stories about the truth behind the Bigfoot mystery, please subscribe to the channel. The rain in Washington doesn't wash things clean. It just pushes the dirt deeper into the cracks. My name is Frank Morrison, and in 1994, I was a man wearing a badge that felt heavier every year. At 56, I was the oldest detective in the Snoqualmie precinct, a department small enough to know everyone's business, but big enough to have real problems. I had spent 30 years chasing bad men through the timber and the mud, driven by a simple, perhaps naive belief that the truth always floats to the surface if you wait long enough. I was a grinder, the kind of cop who re-interviews witnesses 3 times just to catch a hesitation in their voice. My office was a testament to a life spent looking backward. The walls were lined with filing cabinets that smelled of stale coffee and old paper, each drawer a repository of broken lives. I didn't have hobbies, I didn't fish, and I didn't hunt. My wife Martha had passed 5 years prior, leaving me with a silent house and a job that consumed the empty hours. Justice wasn't just my profession, it was my distraction. It was the only way I knew how to make sense of a chaotic world, by putting the pieces back together when someone else smashed them apart. I knew the woods around Mount Rainier better than the rangers did. To most people, the forest was a postcard, green, majestic, serene. To me, it was a crime scene waiting to happen. I knew where the logging roads ended and the dead zones began. I knew how quickly a body could disappear in the undergrowth, reclaimed by the ferns and the moss. The wilderness was beautiful, but it was indifferent to human suffering. It didn't care if you were lost or hurt or murdered. That was my job, to care when the landscape didn't. My reputation was built on being the closer for the hard cases. I wasn't flashy. I didn't kick down doors unless I had to. I was the guy who sat in the interview room for 8 hours, drinking lukewarm water, waiting for the suspect to blink. I believed in the sanctity of the victim. When a life is taken, the universe tilts off its axis, and it doesn't right itself until someone answers for it. It was a rigid moral code, maybe too rigid for the 90s, but it was the only compass I had left. The younger guys on the force called me the archivist because I never threw anything away. I kept notes on napkins, receipts, matchbooks. I believed that the devil was in the details, in the things that looked like trash to everyone else. I knew that evil wasn't always a grand, sweeping gesture. Sometimes, evil was just a sloppy mistake, a moment of rage, a loose thread that needed to be pulled, and I was the one who kept pulling until the whole sweater unraveled. In the summer of '94, the heat wave hit the Pacific Northwest like a fever. The timber was dry, the air was thick with pollen and dust, and tensions in town were high. We had a string of burglaries, a few bar fights that got out of hand, but nothing that kept me up at night. I spent my evenings on the porch, listening to the crickets, feeling a strange unease settling in my gut. It's a feeling every old cop knows, the atmospheric pressure drop before the storm breaks. I often drove the patrol routes myself, just to keep my eyes on the territory. I watched the tourists flood into the national park, oblivious to the dangers lurking off the marked trails. They saw the mountains as a playground. I saw them as a labyrinth. I saw the isolation, the shadows, the places where a scream would simply be swallowed by the canopy. I was protective of my town, perhaps to a fault. I took it personally when things went wrong on my watch. August brought a hazy, golden light that made everything look dreamlike, but I knew better than to trust the view. I was reviewing cold cases, trying to find a fresh angle on a robbery from '92, when the call came in. It was the dispatcher, her voice tight and professional, the tone she used when the news was bad. A missing person report, not a runaway teen or a hiker who lost the trail for an hour. This was different. The parents were in the lobby and they weren't just worried, they were terrified. I walked out to meet them, straightening my tie, putting on the mask of calm authority that I had worn for 3 decades. I didn't know then that this case would be the one to break me. I didn't know that the investigation would lead me off the map of human law and into a jurisdiction I didn't understand. I was prepared for a manhunt. I was prepared for a tragedy. I wasn't prepared for the woods to look back at me. As I took the initial statement, watching the mother's hand shake as she held a photo of her daughter, I felt the familiar weight settling onto my shoulders. It was the weight of a promise I was about to make, a promise to find answers no matter where they were hidden. I looked at the photo, a smiling girl with bright eyes, and pinned it to the corkboard of my mind. The hunt was on, and I was the hound. But this time, The scent trail was going to lead me to a witness that no jury would ever believe. Sarah Chen was 22, a geology student at UW with a future as bright as the quartz she studied. On August 14, 1994, she parked her beige Toyota Corolla at the Moach Lake trailhead, intending to spend the afternoon collecting samples. She was responsible, the kind of kid who left a detailed itinerary on the fridge and called her mom every Sunday. When she didn't call that evening, the alarm bells rang immediately. We found her car locked, her purse hidden under the seat, a half-eaten granola bar on the dashboard. It was a snapshot of a life interrupted, a mundane moment frozen in time before the nightmare began. The initial search was a chaotic mobilization of manpower and desperation. We had search and rescue teams grid searching the valley, helicopters chopping the air overhead, and bloodhounds straining against their leashes. For 3 days I lived at the command post, drinking pot after pot of sludge coffee, watching the topographic maps for a miracle. But the mountain is vast, and the terrain is unforgiving. The dogs lost the scent at the edge of a scree field, confused by the shifting winds. The forest seemed to have simply inhaled her. 2 weeks later, the hope evaporated. A pair of hikers looking for mushrooms found her in a ravine 3 miles off the main trail, a place so dense with devil's club and fir that you could walk past it 10 times and see nothing. It wasn't a rescue mission anymore. It was a recovery. I hiked in with the coroner, my boots slipping on the wet needles, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. The moment I saw the positioning of the body, I knew this wasn't a fall or hypothermia. She had been concealed, covered hastily with branches and moss. This was the work of human hands. Processing the scene was a nightmare of contamination and frustration. The heavy rains that week had scrubbed the forest floor clean of footprints, fibers, or DNA. We were looking for a needle in a haystack that had been washed by a fire hose. I spent hours on my hands and knees, sifting through the mud, looking for a button, a cigarette butt, anything that didn't belong. The killer had been careful, or just lucky. The only physical evidence we had was Sarah herself and the silence of the trees that had witnessed her final moments. The autopsy confirmed my gut instinct: strangulation. It was personal, violent, and messy. There were defensive wounds on her hands. She had fought like hell. The medical examiner found traces of skin under her fingernails. But back in '94, DNA profiling was slow and often inconclusive with degraded samples. We had a profile of the killer: male, strong, likely familiar with the area to navigate that deep into the brush without a trail. But male and strong described half the population of the logging towns surrounding the mountain. I worked the case until my eyes blurred. I interviewed every registered sex offender in 3 counties. I grilled the boyfriend until he broke down in tears, but his alibi held up tight. He was at a Mariners game, captured on the Jumbotron. I tracked down drifters living in campers off the Forest Service roads, men with rough hands and no addresses, but none of them fit the timeline. Every lead that looked promising crumbled into dust the moment I applied pressure. The investigation was spinning its wheels in the mud. By October, the case was officially growing cold. The press vans packed up and left, chasing the next tragedy. Sarah's file sat on the corner of my desk, a thick stack of reports that amounted to zero. Her mother called me every Friday at 4 p.m., asking if there was news. Telling her no was a slow form of torture. I started taking the file home with me, spreading the crime scene photos on my dining table, staring at the images of the ravine, hoping that if I looked long enough, a pattern would emerge from the chaos. The lack of justice gnawed at me. I couldn't sleep. I'd lie in bed listening to the rain, imagining Sarah alone in the dark, wondering who had watched her, who had followed her. I felt like I had failed her. The forest felt different to me now. It wasn't just a landscape, it was an accomplice. It was hiding a monster. I knew the killer was likely still out there, living his life, drinking beer, thinking he had gotten away with it. That thought was a splinter in my mind that I couldn't dig out. In a desperate bid to shake something loose, I decided to go back to the ravine. It was late October, the air crisp and smelling of decay. I didn't take a team. I just took my revolver, my notepad, and a thermos. I needed to stand in the spot where she died, to soak in the atmosphere, to see if I had missed a line of sight or an escape route. I parked my cruiser on the logging road and hiked the 3 miles in, the silence of the woods pressing in on me like a physical weight. I reached the crime scene around noon. The yellow tape was still there, tattered and faded by the elements, flapping lazily in the breeze. I stood in the center of the clearing, closing my eyes, trying to reconstruct the struggle. That's when the hair on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't a sound. I didn't hear a twig snap or a bird cry. It was a feeling, primal and immediate. I was being watched. I opened my eyes and slowly turned toward the dense tree line, my hand drifting to my holster. Something massive was moving in the shadows. Something that didn't move like a deer or a bear. I drew my .38 special before my conscious mind even registered what I was seeing. The shape stepped out from behind a Douglas fir, unfolding itself like a shadow detaching from the tree. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, covered in dark matted hair that absorbed the dappled sunlight. It wasn't a bear standing on its hind legs. The anatomy was all wrong. It had broad shoulders, long arms that hung past its knees, and a chest like a barrel. My training screamed threat, and I leveled the barrel at its center mass, my hand steady despite the adrenaline dumping into my system like ice water. I was staring at a myth, breathing heavy and smelling of wet musk. But the creature didn't charge. A bear would have false charged or run. A cougar would have vanished. This thing stood its ground, but its body language was confusing. It was shifting its weight from foot to foot, pacing in a tight semicircle, waving its long arms in the air. It looked agitated, frantic even. It was making a sound I'll never forget. Not a roar, but a high-pitched, chattering whine that sounded unnervingly like a human in the throes of a panic attack. It wasn't trying to intimidate me. It was trying to get my attention. I kept the gun trained on it, backing up slowly until my back hit a tree. "Back off!" I shouted, my voice sounding thin and ridiculous in the vastness of the woods. The creature stopped pacing and looked directly at me. Its face was dark, leathery, and shockingly expressive. The eyes weren't the flat, reflective eyes of an animal. They were deep, brown, and filled with a frantic intelligence. I saw fear there, but not fear of me. It was the kind of look I'd seen on witnesses who had just watched a car wreck, a look of desperate helplessness. The Bigfoot turned away from me and gestured toward the ground, specifically toward the depression in the earth where Sarah's body had been found. It pointed with a long, thick finger, then looked back at me, then pointed again. It did this 3 times, emphasizing the motion with a sharp grunt. My detective brain, trained to analyze behavior, hiccuped. This wasn't predatory behavior. This was communicative. The creature was linking me to the crime scene. It knew why I was there. It knew that the patch of disturbed earth was significant. It suddenly dropped to its knees, a movement that shook the ground, and began to slap the dirt with its open palms. It let out a mournful, undulating howl that made the hair on my arm stand up. It was a display of grief, or perhaps frustration. It grabbed a handful of leaves and threw them over its shoulder, then looked at me again, chattering rapidly. It was like watching a game of charades played by a giant. It was trying to convey a concept that it didn't have the words for, and its inability to make me understand was driving it into a frenzy. I lowered the revolver an inch. If it wanted to kill me, it could have covered the 20 feet between us in a second. It wasn't attacking, it was pleading. The creature saw me lower the weapon and seemed to calm down slightly. It stood up and walked over to a sapling near the crime scene tape. It grabbed the trunk and gave it a violent shake, snapping the top off. Then, it pointed to the broken tree, then to the spot where Sarah died. Broken. That was the message. Something was broken here. I took a tentative step forward. "What did you see?" I asked, feeling insane for interrogating a cryptid. The creature tilted its head, listening to the tone of my voice. It mimicked the cadence of my question with a soft, grumbling mumble. It tapped its own chest, then pointed to the woods to the east, the direction of the old logging road. It was giving me a direction. It was telling me that the broken thing had come from there, or gone there. It was offering a lead. The intensity of the encounter was exhausting. The creature seemed to realize that I wasn't understanding the full picture. It let out a huff of air, sagging its shoulders in a human-like gesture of defeat. It looked at the crime scene one last time, a look of profound sorrow crossing its features, and then began to back away. It didn't turn its back on me. It retreated respectfully, keeping its hands visible. It wanted me to know it was leaving, but it wasn't fleeing. It paused at the tree line, blending perfectly with the shadows. It raised one hand and made a sweeping motion, as if brushing something away, then pointed at me. "You." It was assigning responsibility. It had shown me what it could, and now it was putting the burden back on me. Then, with a silence that defied its size, it slipped into the dense timber and vanished. I was left standing in the clearing, my heart hammering against my ribs, the smell of musk still hanging in the air. I holstered my gun, my hands trembling as the adrenaline crashed. I looked at the spot where the creature had stood, then at the spot where Sarah had died. The connection was undeniable. I hadn't just brushed against the supernatural. I had made contact with a witness. I realized with a jolt that I had been wrong about the case being cold. There was someone who had seen everything. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my microcassette recorder. I didn't need a weapon anymore. I needed to learn how to listen to a language I didn't speak. I returned to the ravine every day for the next week. treating the forest clearing like an interrogation room. I left the revolver locked in the glove box of my cruiser, carrying only a thermos of black coffee and my dictaphone. It was a gamble, trusting a predator with my life, but my gut told me that the aggression I had seen was born of frustration, not malice. On the third day, he appeared again. He didn't hide this time. He sat on a fallen nurse log 20 yards away, watching me with a weary intensity. We sat in silence for an hour, two old men from different species, establishing a perimeter of trust. I pressed the record button on the microcassette, the small wheel hissing as it turned. October 24th, 1400 hours, I whispered, feeling the absurdity of the words. Contact established with the witness. The Bigfoot watched the device in my hand, his ears twitching at the mechanical whir. I spoke to him in a low, even tone, the same voice I used to talk suicide jumpers off the ledge. I told him my name. I told him I was looking for the bad man. I didn't expect him to understand the English, but I hoped he would understand the intent. He chuffed softly, a sound of acknowledgement, and leaned forward. The breakthrough happened with sticks. The creature stood up and gathered several fallen branches, arranging them deliberately on the forest floor. He laid two long sticks parallel to each other, a road. Then he placed a square stone in the middle of the road. He pointed to the stone, then made a grinding mechanical noise deep in his throat. It was an engine. He was describing a vehicle. He looked at me, waiting for the light bulb to go on. I nodded slowly. "The car," I said. "You saw her car." He became animated, satisfied that the barrier had been breached. He moved the stone off the road and into the woods he had built with pine cones. He was showing me the abduction, or at least the transport. He grabbed a handful of dirt and rubbed it over the stone, burying it. He was describing concealment. My heart raced. This wasn't just vague signaling. This was a detailed reconstruction of the crime scene logistics. The witness had been watching from the tree line while the killer hid the body. I narrated everything into the dictaphone, my voice shaking. Witness indicates suspect vehicle was moved off the main road. Witness indicates concealment was deliberate. The Bigfoot watched me speak into the machine, seeming to understand that the device was my memory. He picked up a twig and snapped it violently, then threw it down. He made a sharp, guttural bark, an angry sound. He stomped the ground with his massive foot. He was acting out the demeanor of the killer. Rage. The killer had been in a rage. Then came the pantomime of the murder itself. It was the hardest thing I have ever had to watch. The creature stood up and wrapped his massive hands around his own throat. He didn't squeeze, but he mimicked the struggle, the thrashing, the gasping for air. He made a high-pitched, keening sound that stopped my blood cold. It was Sarah's voice. He was mimicking the last sound she made. I had to look away, fighting the bile rising in my throat. He wasn't mocking her. He was reporting the facts. He was showing me exactly how she died. He pointed to his wrist, tapping it repeatedly with a long finger. At first I thought he was indicating time, but the gesture was too specific. He circled his wrist with his other hand. A watch? Restraints? He made a metallic click sound with his tongue. Handcuffs. The killer had used handcuffs. This was a detail the coroner hadn't found because of the decomposition, but it fit the profile of a predator who wanted control. I recorded it instantly. Possible restraints used. Witness mimicking binding of wrists. The creature sat back down, exhausted by the performance. He looked at me with those deep, sorrowful eyes, and I saw a reflection of the same burnout I saw in the mirror every morning. He had been carrying this secret for 2 months, alone in the woods, with no way to purge it. He had watched a life get snuffed out and had been unable to stop it, or perhaps too afraid to intervene. I recognized the look. It was the survivor's guilt that haunts every partner who loses a cop in the line of duty. I tried to get him to describe the killer's face. I touched my own face, then pointed to the imaginary figure in his drama. The Bigfoot frowned, his brow furrowing. He pulled at the hair on his own chin, then smoothed it down. Then he shook his head and ran a hand over his smooth cheek. No beard, clean shaven. He puffed out his cheeks and broadened his stance, swinging his arms wide. The suspect was big, heavy. Not a drifter, but someone well-fed. Someone who took up space. As the sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting long shadows across our interrogation room, the mood shifted. The Bigfoot didn't just want to report the crime. He wanted me to feel it. He began to pace again, letting out low, distressed whimpers. He kept pointing to the spot where the body was found, then looking at the sky, then back at me. It wasn't just data anymore. It was a plea. He was showing me that the balance of the woods had been upset, and he needed me, the man with the badge, to fix it. It became painfully clear that I wasn't just interviewing a witness, I was counseling a victim. The Bigfoot wasn't merely relaying data like a cold computer. He was reliving a nightmare. Every time he returned to the clearing, his demeanor changed. The massive shoulders slumped, his breathing became shallow and ragged, and a low, vibrating whine started deep in his chest. In my years on the force, I had seen this behavior in shell-shocked veterans and children pulled from abusive homes. It was post-traumatic stress disorder, raw and untreated, manifesting in a creature that wasn't supposed to have the capacity for psychological damage. The reenactments were compulsive. He couldn't stop himself from going back to the specific tree where the struggle had ended. He would stand there, trembling, reaching out to touch the bark as if trying to change the past. He would act out the chaotic movements of the fight, flailing his arms against an invisible attacker, then suddenly freeze, mimicking the terrifying stillness of death. It was a loop he was stuck in, a jagged groove in a record that kept skipping back to the moment of violence. He was trying to process an event that defied the natural order of his world. I realized that for him, violence in the wild was usually for survival, predator and prey, a clean and necessary cycle. But what he had witnessed with Sarah was different. It was malice. It was cruelty for the sake of cruelty. The creature paced around the perimeter of the crime scene, kicking at the dirt, distressed by the lingering wrongness of the act. He seemed to understand that this wasn't a kill for food or territory. It was a violation. His agitation showed me that he possessed a moral compass, primitive perhaps, but undeniably present. He knew that what happened to the girl was evil. He began to show physical signs of his distress. I noticed patches on his forearms where the fur was thinned, likely from anxious grooming or pulling. He looked thinner than he had in our first encounter, his eyes sunken and rimmed with red. He wasn't sleeping. I could see it in the sluggish way he moved when he wasn't manic. He was carrying the weight of the murder alone in the silence of the forest, and it was eating him alive. He had sought me out not just to report a crime, but to share the burden of the horror. One afternoon, he brought me a small flat stone. He placed it gently on the ground and then curled his large body around it, making a soft cooing sound, a sound a parent might make to a child. Then, he abruptly stood up and made a slashing motion with his hand, scattering the leaves nearby. He looked at me with an expression of devastating helplessness. He was telling me that he had wanted to intervene. He was confessing his guilt for doing nothing. He had watched from the shadows, paralyzed by fear or instinct, and that inaction was a poison in his blood. The need for validation was palpable. When I nodded and said, I know it was bad," he would visibly relax for a moment. He needed a witness to his witnessing. He needed someone else to acknowledge the reality of what he saw, so he wouldn't be alone with it. It struck me that justice isn't just a legal concept, it's a biological need. Even this creature, living outside of civilization, felt the imbalance caused by unpunished sin. He couldn't rest until the scales were balanced, until the chaos was ordered by an answer. He started pushing me, not physically, but behaviorally. After he would finish his pantomime of the crime, he would point aggressively at the logging road, then point at me, then slap his hands together in a gesture of finality. He was demanding action. He didn't want to just tell the story, he wanted the story to end. He understood that I was the enforcer of my tribe. He had seen my gun, my badge, my authority. He was deputizing me. He was pleading with me to go out there and find the monster that he was too afraid to confront. I recorded his distress on the microcassette, my own voice cracking as I described the scene. Witness exhibits extreme emotional volatility. Subject appears to be seeking resolution. Listening to the tapes later, the sounds of his whimpering were harder to hear than the descriptions of the violence. It was the sound of innocence lost. I looked at this 8-foot giant and saw a being that had been broken by human darkness. We had brought our sickness into his home, and now he was infected with our trauma. The connection between us deepened through this shared pain. I stopped bringing my gun. I started bringing food, apples, sandwiches, which he took with a gentle, tentative grace. We would sit for long stretches in the quiet, just breathing, acknowledging the heavy truth that lay between us. I was no longer a hunter, and he was no longer a cryptid. We were just two old males, tired and haunted, trying to make sense of a dead girl in the ferns. He trusted me to fix it. He trusted me to be the mechanism of justice he couldn't be. But as I drove back to the station that evening, the heavy reality of the situation crashed down on me. I had the witness. I had the timeline. I had the profile. I had everything I needed to solve the case, except a way to use it. The creature believed in me, believed that I could take his information and make the world right again. He didn't know that in the eyes of the law, he was a hallucination. He didn't know that the justice he craved came with a price tag that neither of us could afford to pay. Armed with the impossible testimony of my witness, I returned to the station with a clarity that was both intoxicating and terrifying. I pulled the case files on the 3 primary suspects I hadn't been able to clear. The Bigfoot's pantomime had given me specific exclusion criteria: clean-shaven, heavy build, a history of rage, and access to a vehicle large enough to transport a body comfortably. 2 of the men on my list were wiry drifters. They didn't fit the physics of the crime the creature had acted out. That left one name staring up at me from the manila folder: Earl Miller, a timber faller with a thick neck and a thicker rap sheet for bar fights and domestic assault. I dug into Miller's background with a new lens. I checked his shift logs. He had been off work the week Sarah disappeared. I checked his vehicle registration. He drove a Ford Bronco, a truck with plenty of cargo space and off-road capability, matching the buried stone vehicle description the creature had built. The pieces were snapping together with a magnetic force. The Bigfoot hadn't just given me a story, he had given me a profile that filtered out the noise. I knew, with the certainty of a man who has seen the footage, that Miller was the one. But knowledge isn't evidence. I sat in the interrogation room across from Miller, a man who smelled of sawdust and arrogance. I had brought him in on a technicality, a precarious hold that wouldn't last more than 24 hours. I pushed him on the timeline. I leaned in and described the scene in the ravine, using the specific details the Bigfoot had shown me: the broken sapling, the way the body was covered. "I know you didn't mean to kill her right away," I bluffed, channeling the creature's sad reenactment. "I know it got out of hand. I know about the handcuffs." Miller flinched. The color drained from his face for a split second when I mentioned the restraints, a detail we had held back from the press. I had him. I saw the panic flare in his eyes. He knew that I knew. But then the survival instinct kicked in. He leaned back, crossed his massive arms, and smiled a thin, cruel smile. "You got proof, Frank? Or are you just telling ghost stories? I want my lawyer." He called my bluff. He knew I didn't have a weapon, a witness, or a DNA match. He walked out of the station an hour later, a free man, leaving me shaking with impotent rage. The collision between my duty as a cop and my conscience as a human being was a head-on wreck. I went to the district attorney, a sharp woman named Hayes, who demanded hard facts. "I know he did it," I pleaded, slamming the file on her desk. "He fits the profile perfectly." She looked at me over her glasses. "Frank, unless you have a witness who can place him at the scene or a physical object linking him to the body, I can't touch him. We need testimony." I had the testimony. It was recorded on a microcassette in my pocket, but it was inadmissible in any court on earth. If I played that tape, or if I tried to explain how I knew about the handcuffs, my career would be over. I would be laughed out of the precinct as the Bigfoot detective. But worse than the humiliation was the inevitable fallout for the witness. If I revealed the source of my information, the ravine wouldn't be a crime scene anymore. It would be ground zero for the greatest scientific discovery in history. The media would descend. The government would quarantine the mountain. They would hunt him down with tranquilizers and nets. I lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, tortured by the moral calculus. Sarah Chen's parents deserved justice. They deserved to see Miller in handcuffs, to have closure for their daughter's stolen life. But did that justice justify the destruction of an innocent being? The Bigfoot had committed no crime. He had only tried to help. If I used him to catch Miller, I would be sentencing him to a life in a cage, or worse, dissection on a lab table. I was the guardian of the law, but I was also the guardian of the secret. I drove past Miller's house late one night. I saw his Bronco in the driveway, the lights on in the living room. He was drinking a beer, watching TV, living the life he had stolen from Sarah. The injustice burned a hole in my gut. I had the silver bullet to take him down, but I couldn't fire it without hitting the bystander behind him. I felt like a corrupt cop, hoarding the truth, protecting a confidential informant that didn't exist in the eyes of the law. I was obstructing justice to save a soul. The pressure from the department was mounting. "Let it go, Frank," the captain said, clapping a hand on my shoulder. "It's a cold case. You can't save everyone." But he didn't know that the case wasn't cold. It was red hot. He didn't know that the witness was waiting in the woods, trusting me to finish the job. I went back to the ravine, feeling like a traitor. The Bigfoot was there, waiting. He looked at me with expectation, pointing to the badge on my chest. "Did you get him?" I had to shake my head. "No," I whispered to the giant. "I couldn't do it." The creature let out a low, frustrated growl and paced the clearing, kicking at the leaves. He didn't understand the legal system. He didn't understand reasonable doubt or admissible evidence. He only understood right and wrong. He looked at me with a profound disappointment that cut deeper than any reprimand from my superiors. He knew the bad man was still out there, and he couldn't understand why the man with the gun and the badge was powerless to stop him. I began to realize that I was underestimating the witness. I had viewed him as a highly intelligent animal reacting to trauma, but he was demonstrating a grasp of abstract concepts that belonged in a philosophy classroom, not a forest. He understood the difference between a kill and a murder. I had seen him hunt. I had watched him snap the neck of a rabbit with efficient, dispassionate speed. That was nature. But when he reenacted Sarah's death, he slowed down. He emphasized the cruelty, the struggle, the unnecessary duration of the act. He grasped the concept of malice. He knew that what Earl Miller had done was a violation of the natural law, a sin that required a reckoning. The creature seemed to understand the purpose of my badge. I had shown it to him early on, tapping the metal shield and then pointing to myself. He had studied it, sniffing the brass, and then pointed to the gun on my hip. He made the connection. The badge authorizes the gun. To him, I was the alpha of the human pack, the one responsible for policing the tribe. His frustration with me wasn't just confusion, it was a critique of my leadership. In his eyes, a dangerous element was loose in my territory, and I was failing to neutralize it. He was appealing to my authority with a desperate insistence. He tried to bridge the gap of the legal system with the only tools he had. One rainy Tuesday, he arrived at the ravine carrying a rusted piece of metal, a tire iron. It wasn't the murder weapon, just debris from an old logging truck, but he presented it to me like an attorney presenting Exhibit A. He mimicked striking something, then pointed to the ground. He was understanding the concept of evidence. He knew that objects told stories, and he was trying to give me the physical leverage he thought I needed. He was trying to participate in an investigation he was biologically barred from entering. The tragedy was that he wanted to testify. I could see it in the way he tried to refine his sign language. He would repeat a gesture, the choking motion, the handcuff motion, over and over, watching my face for comprehension. When I nodded, he would let out a soft grunt of satisfaction. He was building a deposition. He was recounting the facts for the record. If he could have walked into a courtroom, raised his right hand, and spoken, Earl Miller would be on death row. But the creature seemed to sense the invisible wall between us. He knew he couldn't leave the tree line. He understood the concept of incarceration, or at least containment. He would often trap a beetle in his cupped hands, show it to me, and then look at the imaginary bad man he had built out of sticks. He would slam his hand down over the stick figure. He wanted the killer contained. He wasn't asking for blood vengeance. He wasn't mimicking tearing the man apart. He was mimicking removal. This restraint was staggering. He didn't want to be the executioner. He wanted the system to work. He was asking for justice, not revenge. I felt a profound sense of shame standing before him. Here was a being that science classified as a monster, yet he was displaying a higher civic consciousness than most of the citizens in my town. He had witnessed a wrong and was risking his own safety to set it right. He was a whistleblower. He was the only good Samaritan who had stopped for Sarah Chen, even if he had been too afraid to intervene in the moment. His persistence was a moral indictment of the human world that allowed men like Miller to walk free. He began to offer me leads, in a physical sense. He would walk to the edge of the clearing, look back at me, and wave his arm, urging me to follow. He wanted to take me somewhere, perhaps to where he had seen Miller's truck parked, or to a spot where he had seen Miller before. He wanted to be my partner. He wanted to ride shotgun. The thought of it, a detective and a Bigfoot tracking a killer through the Pacific Northwest, was a fantasy that broke my heart. I had to stay put. I couldn't explain to him that if he stepped out of the shadows, the hunt for the killer would end, and the hunt for the beast would begin. His disappointment when I wouldn't follow him was crushing. He would drop his arms, his massive shoulders sagging, and let out a sound that was half sigh, half growl. He would look at the sky, as if asking the universe why the rules were so stupid. He knew the truth. I knew the truth. But the mechanism to act on that truth was broken. He was screaming into the void, and I was the only one listening, paralyzed by the paradox of my duty. I sat on the log one afternoon, head in my hands, exhausted by the stalemate. The creature approached me silently and sat down, closer than he had ever been. He reached out a long, fur-covered arm and gently tapped the back of my hand with one finger. It was a gesture of solidarity. I know you were trying. In that moment, the barrier of species evaporated. We were just two cops working a case that wouldn't break. He understood the burden of the badge, even if he didn't wear one. But the appeal in his eyes never wavered. As the weather turned colder, signaling the coming winter that would separate us, his urgency grew. He knew the snow would hide the tracks. He knew the trail was freezing over. He would stare at me with a piercing intensity, pointing at my chest, then at the dictaphone in my pocket. Use it. He didn't know how the machine worked, but he knew it held the story. He was trusting me to be his voice. He was passing the torch of responsibility to the only person who could carry it out of the woods. November 1995 brought the first heavy snows to the Cascades, sealing the logging roads and closing the door on the season. I sat in my patrol car at the trailhead, the heater humming, holding the microcassette in my hand. It was tiny, a piece of plastic smaller than a matchbox, but it weighed more than the engine block of the cruiser. On that magnetic strip was the voice of the witness, the reenactment of the murder, and my own narration connecting Earl Miller to the crime. It was the complete solved case file of Sarah Chen. It was the truth. And I knew, with a sickening certainty, that I could never let anyone hear it. I hit the record button one last time to add a prologue. "This is Detective Frank Morrison," I said, my voice sounding old and tired in the confined space. "The following recording contains the testimony of a witness to the homicide of Sarah Chen. This witness cannot be subpoenaed. This witness cannot be protected by the state. If this tape is released, the witness will be hunted and likely destroyed." I paused, watching the snow pile up on the windshield. I am sealing this evidence to protect the innocent, even if it means the guilty walk free. I listened to the playback. Behind my voice, you could hear the background noise of the forest, the wind, the rustle of leaves, and the distinct, mournful vocalizations of the Bigfoot. To a prosecutor, it would sound like madness. To a scientist, it would sound like the discovery of the millennium. If I dropped this on the DA's desk, Earl Miller might go to prison, but the Snoqualmie National Forest would be turned into a militarized zone. The creature had trusted me to fix the broken thing, but he didn't know that fixing it would cost him his freedom. I made the hike to the ravine one last time to say goodbye. The woods were silent, draped in a heavy blanket of white. The crime scene tape was gone, buried under the drifts. He was there, waiting in the shelter of the hemlocks. He didn't pace this time. He stood perfectly still, covered in snow, looking like a statue of an ancient god. He looked at me, then at my empty hands. He knew. He sensed the resignation in my posture. I didn't bring the handcuffs. I didn't bring the bad man. I brought nothing but an apology. "I can't do it," I told him, my breath pluming in the cold air. "I can't trade your life for his." The Bigfoot tilted his head, listening to the tone of defeat. He let out a long, low sigh, a sound of infinite weariness. He looked at the direction of the town, then back at me. He didn't growl. He didn't rage. He simply nodded, a slow human gesture of acceptance. He understood that the system was broken. He understood that sometimes the bad men win. He walked over to me, towering over my 6-foot frame, and placed a hand on my shoulder. The heat radiating from him was intense, burning through my parka. It was a benediction. He was absolving me of my failure. Then he turned and walked into the whiteout. He didn't look back. He moved with a heavy, deliberate grace, disappearing into the storm, taking the secret of Sarah Chen back into the deep timber where human law couldn't reach. I stood there until my toes went numb, watching the footprints fill with snow, erasing the evidence of his existence. Watching Earl Miller walk around town for the next few years was a slow-acting poison. I saw him at the diner, laughing with his friends, eating pie with the hands that had strangled a girl. I wanted to scream. I wanted to play the tape over the town PA system, but I kept my mouth shut. I swallowed the bile. I had made a choice between two injustices, and I chose the one that protected the being that had never sinned. Miller was a monster, but he was a human monster. The Bigfoot was something pure, and I refused to feed him to the machine. I retired 6 months later. I couldn't wear the badge anymore. It felt like a lie. I took the case file home, another violation of procedure, and locked it in my personal safe along with the microcassette. I labeled it the Chen Confession and threw away the key. It sits there next to my service revolver, a loaded gun of a different kind. I look at the safe sometimes, wondering if I did the right thing. I wonder if Sarah's parents would forgive me if they knew. But then I think of the giant in the snow, the intelligence in those eyes, and I know I couldn't have done it any other way. The case officially went cold. The files gathered dust in the basement of the precinct. Earl Miller died of a heart attack in 2001, escaping earthly justice entirely. When I heard the news, I drove out to the trailhead and sat there for an hour. "He's gone," I whispered to the trees. "It's over." I don't know if the witness was still out there listening. I don't know if he felt the shift in the universe when Miller died. But I like to think that somewhere in the high country a weight was lifted off a pair of massive shoulders. I am an old man now, and the tape is my burden to carry to the grave. I wrote a letter to be opened after my death, explaining everything to my son, instructing him to destroy the cassette without listening to it. Some truths are too dangerous to be known. The world isn't ready to know that the best detective I ever worked with was an 8-foot hominid who cried for a dead girl. The justice we sought wasn't found in a courtroom. It was found in the quiet understanding between two species that, for one brief, tragic season, tried to make the world right.